Jordan Peterson, everybody. Jordan, we got a great crowd for you. Thank you so much for doing this. We know it's late in Finland. He's off espousing good ideas for the rest of the world. And Jordan, we can't thank you enough for your leadership and for being such an intellectual leader in our movement and our world today. So thank you. I'm going to kick off these questions just with one, really, and kind of cue Jordan up to talk about something he's been working on a lot, and then we're going to go straight to the students' questions that we have. Jordan, I want you to talk to us about what you've written recently, this conservative manifesto. It's a defense of Western civilization, a very profound one. Can you walk us through that? And in doing so, you touch on a lot of the divisions or differences, psychologically especially, that you often see between the left and the right, and what conservatives have to offer for the world, especially in this day and age.
Well, I think the easiest way into understanding the conservative manifesto is to think about it in some sense as a critique of liberalism and maybe even a critique of Protestantism in its extreme forms. So we're in the midst of a culture war that's being fought over, at least in part, varied claims to identity. And the most radical claim that confronts our culture from the radical left is that identity is in some sense subjectively defined. And that's actually the logical consequence of a very long historical development. So one of the things the psychoanalyst Carl Jung said about Protestantism near the end of the Second World War was that the logical conclusion of the Protestant Revolution is that every single person would become their own church. Now, he also believed that Catholicism on the Christian side had its flaws, and that would be the flaws that go along with a tendency to too great a hierarchical structure and too rigid a tradition. But the Protestant emphasis on the individual, combined with the liberal emphasis on the individual, is given rise, at least in part, to these identity claims. And then I would say, to some degree, that's been aided and abetted by psychologists and psychiatrists, and of all sorts, from psychoanalytic to humanist, who have made the claim in some real sense that sanity is something to be primarily understood as a manifestation of the individual. And so if you're a sane person, it's because you're well integrated psychologically and not subjectively. And I'm afraid that's wrong. It's wrong. It was illustrated as wrong, perhaps most fundamentally, by another psychologist. That would be Jean Piaget, who was the world's greatest developmental psychologist. And one of the things he pointed out very clearly was that when children made the transition from age 2 to age 3, they went from a egocentrism that made it impossible for them to play with others to being able to adopt a shared frame of reference and a jointly established social identity that was also at the same time psychological. So imagine that you're miserable, and then imagine that you're miserable in your marriage. And then you might say, well, are you miserable because you're ill-constituted psychologically, or are you miserable because your relationship isn't what it should be? And the answer is both. And so then you might ask yourself as well, do you think you could be sane for any length of time if you went through your life and you had no intimate relationship and you had no children and the close family bonds that would entail, and you had no parents or siblings, and you had no friends, and you had no social community whatsoever? Could you still be well integrated psychologically? And the answer to that is clearly no. We know, for example, that you can punish people intensely, even if they're very antisocial, by subjecting them to solitary confinement. And that in itself shows how dependent psychological well-being and sanity is on proper nesting within a hierarchically structured social community. And so then it's probably better to think of both identity and sanity in a rather musical manner. In a great symphony, every note and every phrase has its place within the totality that's defined by the whole of the piece. and every part plays its part in the magnificence of the whole, let's say. And so if you're a popular child, you can play well with others, and that means that you can adopt shared and socially negotiated frameworks of identity. And if you're a well-constituted and popular and desirable adult, in all likelihood, you have a long-term intimate relationship. You have children or siblings and parents, and you've established good relations with them, and you keep each other mutually in check and mutually motivated and mutually sane. And then you have friends who are surrounding you who are contributing to that sanity, and then your family and your friends and your marriage are integrated into a broader community, and maybe you adopt your civic identity in relationship to that broader community, as all of you are doing tonight, merely by attending this event. You've decided that you're going to step outside the narrow confines of your subjectively defined identity and contribute in some manner to the integrity of the whole and all its parts. And then above the local civic community is the level of the state, and then the level of the nation, and then the level of the international order. And all of those have to be in sync and in harmony in some real sense for any individual within that entire hierarchy to be truly sane. And how sane do you think you could be in the middle of a war fought between your nation and another nation? And I'm afraid you all might have the opportunity to find out sooner rather than later, although I hope that that's not the case. And so I predicated the Conservative Manifesto on the proposition that what conservatives have to offer young people is a much more comprehensive view of what constitutes identity than this idiot solipsistic claim that you define yourself subjectively like a 2-year-old, and that you can demand that people treat you according to how you feel, whatever that means, in opposition to the identity that you would negotiate as a fair player with other people. And so conservatives can say to young people, look, you want to find meaning in your life. You want to find the meaning that sustains you through catastrophe. You want to be able to be a resilient person. You want to have worthwhile things to do. And you're going to find that primarily in the service that you grant to others and in the responsibility that you voluntarily shoulder. And that's a much different story than you get to be whatever you want moment to moment because of how you feel, and that all constraints placed on your hedonic short-term self-satisfaction are to be regarded as nothing but the manifestation of power and tyranny. That's such a demoralizing viewpoint, especially for young people. You know, when you talk to anybody who's a little older and maybe has the wisdom that goes along with age, if they're fortunate, they know perfectly well that the most of the significant and sustaining meaning that they've found in their life is a consequence of reciprocal service to others and voluntarily undertaken responsibility. That shouldn't be regarded as a limit in some sense on the quality of your life. You know, people think of marriage as a unnecessary, bureaucratic, ridden, patriarchal arrangement that's nothing but oppression, and they think of children as nothing but excess responsibility, and that's utter rubbish. You could make the same case, I suppose, about career and education. It's like, those are opportunities, man. And they're opportunities to do something significant with your life. And you're going to need to do that because you're going to encounter periods of suffering, intense suffering, when it's difficult for you to make sense out of the logic of existence. And what you'll have in those situations is, if you're fortunate, you'll have the goodwill that you've generated as a consequence of being a upstanding, productive, and generous individual and citizen. And then perhaps you'll have a little arc that can sustain you through the worst storms of your life. And this is something that conservatives really can tell to young people, is you're going to find the sustaining meaning of your life through responsibility. And that is the case. I certainly saw that time and again as a clinical psychologist in all my practice, helping people sort out the desperate chaos of isolated and lonely lives, pointless lives, lives that were expended in futile isolation and in resentful rebelling against the imposition of any responsible order, instead of carrying that forthrightly and understanding how integrally that voluntary commitment is associated with sustaining meaning. And you're going to need it. Mark my words. So, Congressman, that's the That's the background to the Conservative Manifesto. You can all watch that on YouTube if you want. And we're putting together an international group aimed at fostering, let's say, the conservative and centrist liberal spirit in these trying times. And it's predicated to some degree on the same principles that are elucidated in the Conservative Manifesto.
It's worth a read, Jordan. Thank you so much for writing it, and thank you so much for being an advocate for Western values and common sense. You've helped a lot of people, and I bet a lot of people in the audience feel that way too. Let's get to the students' questions. Go ahead and ask your question.
I'm Ezra Criswell from Tomball, Texas, and my question is there a debate that you think you've lost / learned the most from, and if there is, what is it?
Well, I think recently I was giving some real consideration to some of the furor I caused with some of my tweet comments, and also some of the more forcefully aggressive YouTube videos I'd produced on topics that I regarded as requiring a certain degree of force. I'm very unhappy with what's happening, particularly in Europe, let's say at the moment on the so-called environmentalist front. I'm very unhappy that the globalist utopians have decided to sacrifice Europe's poor and then the world's poor to their absolute environmental delusions in a manner that's not only going to impoverish people terribly and starve many to death in all likelihood, but also make the environment much worse than it would otherwise be. And I used, perhaps one might argue, an excess of vitriolic force in making those cases online, as I did when I criticized a certain actor or actress, take your pick, for flaunting the consequences of transgender surgery to 1.5 million people on Instagram and enticing deluded and neurotic young women into doing the same. Anyways, I spent some time with my friends and colleagues in Miami after all that unfolded, in the midst of a debate of goodwill, I would say, between a number of people who claimed that as a consequence of my more aggressive tone, let's say, I alienated a lot of people who might have otherwise listened to my words. And debating on the other side, one of the people on the other side, by the way, who was happy about what I was doing was Dave Rubin. I'm sure many of you know who Rubin is. He thought my tone was appropriate given the seriousness of the topic. And then I sat down with two of my friends, Greg Hurwitz, who leans Democrat, but was a student of mine at Harvard, is a very, very intelligent man and incredibly informed on political matters. And another friend, Jonathan Pajot, who's, I would say, perhaps the deepest religious thinker I've ever met, with the possible exception of his brother. And we sat down and interrogated my behavior, let's say, for about 1.5 hours, and that's on YouTube as well. It's called Mean Tweets. And the reason I wanted to do that was because I really wanted to figure out if there was some manner that I could step forward more effectively. And the only way to really understand how you might rectify your behavior is to subject yourself to rigorous critical analysis. And if you have other people helping, so much the better, because they can shed light on some aspects, dark aspects of your behavior, let's say, that you might be unwilling to face. And so I thought we hashed that out extremely effectively. No, I wasn't set back on my heels in relationship to my tweets, for example, which I still stand by, although I do believe that the criticism that in some sense perhaps I was punching down somewhat counterproductively might have been accurate. And then with regards to the vitriol of my tone, what I tried to do afterwards, I wrote an article for The Telegraph criticizing the consulting company Deloitte for claiming that we are going to have to tighten our belts to contend with the looming climate catastrophe, pointing out that the we who are going to tighten our belts aren't the rich consultants at Deloitte, but like the bottom 2 billion of the world's poor, not to mention the poorest people in Europe. And so I wasn't very happy about that, and I'm still not. But I wrote the article, which was very cutting. It was cutting as I could make it. I was actually quite frightened to publish it, to tell you the truth, because I didn't know what was going to happen. But when I read it on YouTube, I tried to maintain as even an emotional keel as possible. I wasn't doing that manipulatively, you know. I was trying to get the melody right along with the words. And so I dialed it back a lot. And used like you might use minimal necessary force, which is a good behavioral adage when you're protecting yourself. I used minimal necessary emotion. And the consequence was that the ratio of positive to negative comments in relationship to what I said went way up on YouTube. So people were just as convinced, let's say, by the argument that I was putting forth on the merits of the argument alone, but were much less likely to be repelled by the more aggressive and vitriolic tone that you might argue that the subject matter warranted. But what I'm telling you is that I learned that in all things, the lightest possible touch is the most effective. And it's a very difficult thing to manage, especially when you're dealing with issues of well, let's say mass starvation, or when you're being attacked personally in a manner that's actually dangerous. And so I learned an awful lot from that discussion.
It tends to be true that it's easier to persuade someone if you talk with them instead of at them. All right, second question.
My name is Jenna Brodnick. I'm from Tomball, Texas. And my question is it better to be a jack of all trades or a master of one?
Well, it's better to be both if you could manage it. But what you find out in your life when you're young, and you need to know this, all of you, is that you need to get good at least one thing. So you need to get very good at least one thing. You have to specialize in something. And that was really the point of an apprenticeship, right? Because you subject yourself to a master, and I'll use that term despite its connotations, let's say. You subjected yourself voluntarily to the discipline imposed in a single direction. The philosopher Nietzsche pointed out that nothing of any value could be attained, even on the front of freedom, without first subjecting yourself to intense voluntary discipline. And so he thought of voluntary slavery in some sense as the precondition for freedom. And you can think about that. Imagine that you're trying to learn to play a musical instrument. Or imagine what you had to go through when you learned to read. There's that initial process of skill automation, which is very painstaking and difficult. But once you master it, to pass through that disciplinary structure, then you have freedoms that you wouldn't have had before. Once you learn to read music and to position your hands properly on the piano keyboard and to play the appropriate scales and chords, then you can play music, and you couldn't do that to begin with. And so the subjugation of yourself to a disciplinary structure actually frees you, which is another thing conservatives have to tell young people. And then the other thing you'll note, that you do note as you get older, if you've gone through a disciplinary process or a multitude of them, is that they first narrow you as you specialize, but then as you get deeper and deeper into your specialization, the world broadens out in front of you. And so, for example, when I went off to do my PhD, I studied alcoholism. But in order to study alcohol and its effects on the brain, I had to study neuroscience and neuropsychology. And once I started studying neuroscience and neuropsychology, neuropharmacology for that matter as well, then I had to understand, well, turns out I had to understand, at least to the degree I was capable, the functioning of the entire brain, because alcohol washes the entire brain like water. And so I had to write a thesis, which is a disciplinary process, focused particularly on the genetic predisposition among males with multi-generational family histories of alcoholism to alcohol reward. And that's a very specific topic, but it didn't matter, because as I got deeper and deeper into it, it started to reconnect to the whole world. And so it's extremely useful for you to master something. Pick something, or more than one thing, but start with something. And in some sense, it doesn't really matter what it is. It just matters that you do it. And what'll happen is you'll also develop the discipline that goes along with that process of self-mastery. And once you have that discipline instantiated because you subjected yourself voluntarily to a particular goal, you can take that discipline and subject yourself to other goals as a consequence. And so you don't have to worry that if you become a master of one thing, you become a jack of no trades. The greatest people I've met, I knew a great artist in Montreal. He was a very good friend of mine. And he was a licensed taxi driver and a licensed carpenter and a licensed boat pilot and a great interior decorator and extremely skilled socially and a great visual artist. He had that all at his fingertips, and that was multiple masters. He had served multiple masters and become a master himself. And you start the journey toward becoming a master by subjecting yourself to other masters. And that's really what you're supposed to do when you get educated, particularly in the humanities, because that's a apprenticeship with masters. And so you might think, like people often think when they won't discipline their children, that if you constrain your creativity in a single direction, you're going to eradicate your flexibility and your creativity, but you won't. You'll just bring order to your chaos. And once you do that, all that creative potential that you have within you will be much more likely to manifest itself. So it's very useful to seriously discipline yourself voluntarily, especially when you're young. You can find out what constraints you can abide within. You can find out how hard you can push yourself. You can find out how hard you can work. You can find out how productive and generous you can be. And all that's unbelievably useful. And then you can dial it back a bit so it becomes sustainable, But it's good to wear yourself right to the bone if you can while you're young, so you start to understand who you are. And you can't do that without pushing yourself right to the limit. You can't do that without an apprenticeship.
It's excellent advice, and some of you are blessed with knowing exactly what you want to do in life. I was blessed with knowing exactly what I wanted to do in life, and some of you will keep trying to figure it out. But don't stop and do nothing, right? You've got to choose something, and there's meaning in even the activity of pursuing a certain skill or purpose or piece of knowledge. Next.
It can be very discouraging for freedom-loving people to engage the hostile environments of both academia and online culture. How do you suggest young people remain hopeful and mentally healthy in these spaces where they spend so much time of their life?
Well, the first thing I would say, and it's not that this is easy, is that spending less time in those hostile environments is probably a good idea. I spent a fair bit of time on Twitter. It happened to be the social media network that I got most familiar with outside of YouTube. And it was probably a dismal choice. And I had my qualms about using it at all. I felt morally obligated to some degree because I'm interested, let's say, as a clinical psychologist, in appropriate diagnosis. And I knew that there was something pathological about Twitter, but it was impossible to figure out what it was without immersing myself in the mire, let's say, and perhaps contributing to it in some manners that were less than optimal. If you roll around with the pigs, you tend to get dirty. And but maybe you have to roll around with the pigs a little bit to understand the pigs, and maybe that's necessary, especially if they're eating up everything in sight. And so I haven't been on Twitter for quite a while, in part because I'm suspended pending the deletion of a tweet, which I won't delete. And it's been a great relief because those bloody social media platforms mix the demon trolls and the bots with the real human beings. And it's really not good. Narcissistic psychopaths, who compose about 3% of the population, present an ever-present danger to the integrity of society. And they run amok on social media platforms where they can hide behind anonymity and spew the kind of caustic derision that would immediately 100% get someone punched if they ever dared utter such things in the presence of another human being. And yet they can spill that kind of poison into the public domain with no regulation whatsoever by the social media companies, not in any real sense. And while they're also capitalizing on the agitation and the externalized costs that they're forcing the rest of society to bear by their desire to capture attention as a consequence of controversy. And so the problem with those social media networks, especially the comments sections, is that they're not genuinely representative of the manner in which behavior actually manifests itself in the social world. So they're biased games, and they're biased towards demon trolls and bots. And that's a very bad idea. And so to the degree that it's possible, it might be first useful to know that, and second, to free yourself from that so that you're engaging in real world activities that aren't virtualized with as many friends and family members and people that you work for and so on that you possibly can to actually work in the real world. And you might think about that as an analog to the difference between pornography and an actual relationship. You know, you can virtualize sex, but I wouldn't recommend it. And virtualized sex in some sense is much easier. It's much less demanding. It's right there at your fingertips, so to speak. But it's no substitute for the complexities and realities and insanity and sanity of a real world relationship. And it's the same thing with the virtual world. And so do some things that are real and see what you can do to limit your interaction on the social media front. And then on the policy front, one of the things that I think conservatives should insist upon is that social media platforms that have more than 1 million users should have a know your customer requirement just like banks do. And so that people who are commenting in these social media networks have to do so under their real name and a verified name, like they verify with a blue check on Twitter. If you're anonymous, then you should be placed in a different comments category, your own little hell, let's say, along with the rest of the demon trolls and the bots and the derisive LOL, LMFAO, bro and buddy, what would you call it, proclaimers who do nothing but spit caustic vitriol.
I like that.
Yeah,
okay.
It needs to be done. It needs to be done.
We probably have time for one more question, unless you answer real fast, Jordan.
Okay, I don't know if I'm capable of that.
Hello.
You're thorough.
I want to take a different approach and be down to earth and ask you how your day is before I ask you my question.
Oh, it's just fine. I was in Jerusalem this morning. I did a talk, I think it was last night. The days kind of run together with Ben Shapiro and the former ambassador from the U.S. to Israel, David Friedman, and in front of about 4,000 people in Jerusalem, and they were very, very enthusiastic, and it was wonderful to be there. I hadn't been there before, and I flew to Helsinki today, and it was a long day, but it went well, and here I am in Helsinki talking to you. So, you know, that's a pretty good day, pretty good couple of days.
Thank you for taking your time and listening to me.
My pleasure.
I wish I could shake your hand, but we're through a glass screen right now. Do you feel like the United States has lost authority when it comes to defining global norms and adhering to global norms? How has the definition shifted in recent years, and how do we as a nation regain fundamental morals and principles to address what normality genuinely means in today's day and age?
Well, that's what we're trying to figure out at the moment, isn't it, in this discussion? You know, my attitude towards that has always been one of a clinician and a psychologist rather than a sociologist or even a political leader in some real sense. I think the way you do that, the way you restore the moral authority of your nation is by restoring your moral authority and your moral authority in relationship to the relationships that you have. Get your act together. You know, your nation is founded on the principle that each person is a sovereign citizen and a creator of the future, and someone who's made in the image of God, someone who wrestles the chaos of possibility into habitable order using love and truth. And the reason you have the rights you have is because those rights are in some sense fundamental consequences of that divine capacity. And you might ask, well, do you believe that? Well, to the degree that you abide by the dictates of your state and to the degree that you treat other people as if they're worthwhile in and of themselves, then you do believe it. And I would say, well, believe it fully, act it out, put yourself together, don't lie, pick up your responsibility and move forward as forthrightly as you possibly can, repair your relationships. And if enough people do that, then America will reestablish the moral authority that's required and requisite. And I don't think there's any other way of doing it. You know, the leftists talk about the long march through the institutions because they tend to be top-down power mongers on the radical left front. And there's a longer march, which is the long march through the individuals. And that's the march that conservatives and centrist liberals need to focus on. Redemption is an individual issue in many regards, even though we have to be nested in our social communities. And it's an individual responsibility. So evaluate your sins and clean them up and sort out your relationships. And then you can expand outward into the civic community. And you can have a positive influence there. And there's no other way of doing it that's real. All the rest of it's just facade and treachery. So
Jordan, you're
Get
good.
your act together,
You ended
right?
like right
Better for you than
at your
everyone else.
time.
Good.
Jordan, I know you got to get to bed. I know it's late there, and I can't tell you how much we appreciate it that you stayed up for us and that you would address our group like this. You're obviously one of my intellectual heroes. And look, if you follow Jordan Peterson on YouTube, you'll be better, you'll be stronger, and you'll probably know more about psychology than a typical major in psychology. So I can't say enough good things about this man. Jordan, thank you so much for doing this. We appreciate
Well,
you.
thank you, Danny. It was a pleasure to be there. I really do want to come to this event in person. I think this is the second time I did it virtually. I'd love to be there in person one year, and so hopefully that'll happen. Anyways, it was good to talk to all of you, and thank you for your time and attention. And also, kudos to you for showing up to this event. You know, one of the things I've been talking to people all around the world about is the fact that we've abandoned our civic responsibility, and that's not good, because if you abandon your civic responsibility, tyrants pick it up out of your hands. And you people, all you young people, are here doing something public. You know, there's something in it for you, but there's something in it for everyone else too, and that's a good game. So congratulations, and don't underestimate yourself, or overestimate yourself for that matter. So, all right, good night, Congressman Crenshaw, and all of you in the audience.
Dr. Jordan Peterson.